My name is Luca. Yesterday, my own brother looked me in the eye, handed me a check for $50,000, and told me I was fired from the bakery I built. Why? Because he had just broken into my private locker and stolen the only inheritance my grandmother left me, her 100-year-old sourdough starter. He sold our family's soul to a frozen food giant for $20 million, thinking he had finally outsmarted the flour boy. I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I just took the check, ripped it up, and walked away with a smile. Because what my brother doesn't know is that the legacy he stole is actually a decoy jar of dead yeast I keep for the rats. And when that factory line turns on tomorrow morning, he is about to learn a $20 million lesson. You can steal the jar, but if you don't respect the craft, the dough will never rise. To understand why a jar of beige goo is worth destroying a family over, you have to understand the smell of our kitchen at 4 a.m. It smells of caramelized crust, wild fermentation, and history. My grandmother, Nonna Rosa, brought the mother over from Italy in her suitcase during the war. She fed it every day of her life. She taught me that bread is alive, it has a temperament, it needs to be listened to. My brother, Dante, never listened to anything but his own voice. When Nona passed away last year, the will was a shock to everyone but me. She left the building, the brand name, and the bank accounts to my father, Marco, and Dante. To me, she left the mother, just the jar. Dante laughed so hard at the lawyer's office he nearly choked on his sparkling water. He called it spoiled dough. He told me I was lucky Nona didn't leave me her old socks too. He didn't care about the yeast because he has an MBA. He sees the bakery as a scalable asset, not a craft. He looks at my 48-hour fermentation process and sees inefficiency. He looks at the line of customers wrapping around the block in Brooklyn and sees untapped market share. "We are wasting time, Luca," he would lecture me, waving spreadsheets in my face. "We could be freezing this. We could be in every supermarket in America. We just need to stabilize the product." "You can't stabilize Nona's bread," I told him 1,000 times. "It's wild yeast. It changes with the humidity. It changes with the season. You can't put a soul in a microwave box." He stopped arguing with me about a month ago. I thought he had finally respected the craft. I was wrong. He was just waiting for the check to clear. That brings us to yesterday. I arrived at the bakery at 3:30 a.m. to start the mix. Usually, the kitchen is dark and quiet. Yesterday, the lights were blazing. I walked in and felt the air change immediately. The heavy steel door to my climate-controlled proofing room, the one only I had the key to, was standing wide open. The padlock was on the floor, cut with bolt cutters. My stomach dropped. I ran inside. The shelf where Nona's jar lived was empty. I turned around to see Dante standing there, flanked by my father and two men in sterile blue lab coats holding a metal briefcase. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It is being processed," Dante said calmly, adjusting his tie. Global Foods Corp needed a sample of the biological culture to synthesize the flavor profile. We closed the deal, Luca. $20 million for the exclusive licensing rights. "You stole it," I said. "That is mine." "Nona left it to me specifically." "Technically," one of the suits interrupted, "since it was stored on company property and fed with company flour, it is a company asset. We are just securing our investment." My father wouldn't even look at me. He was staring at the floor, a weak man who had let his greed outweigh his mother's wishes. Dante stepped forward and held out the check. "Look, we are not monsters," he said. "We are buying you out. 50,000. That is more than you make in a year kneading dough. Take a vacation. Go to Italy. We are moving production to an industrial facility in Ohio. We don't need a baker anymore. We need chemists." I looked at the check. I looked at the men in lab coats who thought they could reverse engineer love in a test tube. I realized then that they didn't see bread. They saw a product. And because they saw a product, they were blind. I took the check from Dante's hand. He smirked, thinking he had won, thinking that everyone has a price. I ripped it in half, then in quarters. I let the pieces flutter down onto his expensive Italian loafers. You think you can bake Nona's bread without Nona's touch? I asked quietly. It is just biology, Luca, Dante scoffed. Yeast is yeast. Science is reliable. You are not. Now get out, or I will have security escort you. I grabbed my backpack. I didn't say goodbye to my father. I didn't look back at the ovens I had tended for 10 years. I walked out into the cool morning air, pulled out my phone, and booked a one-way ticket to the coast. What Dante didn't know, what he couldn't know, because he never got his hands dirty, was that I had moved the real mother 3 weeks ago. I saw the way the suits were looking at the kitchen. I smelled the betrayal coming. The jar he stole? The one the scientists were currently rushing to a lab in a secure briefcase? It was a mixture of supermarket flour, tap water, and a packet of 99-cent rapid rise yeast I bought at the bodega. It looked the same. It smelled vaguely sour because I added a splash of vinegar. But it was dead. It had no history. It had no power. I patted my backpack, where a small, nondescript mason jar was wrapped in a woolen sweater to keep it warm. Let's see how much bread they can bake with vinegar and hubris, I whispered to the real mother. I turned off my phone. The factory line in Ohio was scheduled to start the first test run in 48 hours. That was exactly how long it would take for them to realize they had bought a $20 million paperweight. I spent the next 48 hours in a small cabin upstate, doing the only two things that matter: feeding the real mother and listening to the silence. I didn't check my email. I didn't turn on the news. I just kneaded dough by hand, watched the wild yeast bubble and breathe in the mountain air, and waited for the inevitable collapse of my brother's arrogance. I didn't have to wait long. The first sign of trouble wasn't a phone call, it was a courier. A private investigator hired by my family found me on the third morning. He didn't have a subpoena. He had a desperate handwritten note from my father. Luca, please call home. It's an emergency. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the fireplace. If they wanted to talk to me, they could do it on my terms. I turned my phone back on. The device nearly exploded in my hand. 140 missed calls, 50 voicemails, 400 texts. I scrolled to the oldest voicemail, dated 2 days ago, the morning of the factory test run in Ohio. It was Dante. His voice was smug, confident. Hey, little brother, just wanted to let you know the test run is starting. The Global Foods team is impressed. We're about to make history. Hope you're enjoying your little vacation. Don't spend that severance check all at once. I skipped ahead 6 hours. Dante's voice again, less smug, a little tight. Luca, pick up. The scientists are asking questions about the hydration levels. The dough isn't reacting. It's just sitting there. Did you change the feeding schedule before you left? Call me back. I skipped ahead another 2 hours. Panic. Luca, pick up the phone. The batch is ruined. 5 tons of flour, Luca. 5 tons. It didn't rise. It's a brick. The technician says the yeast is inactive. What did you do to it? Call me now! And then, the final voicemail from late last night. Dante was whispering, terrified. They ran a DNA analysis on the sample, Luca. They know it's Red Star yeast and vinegar. They are screaming fraud. They are talking about a $50 million lawsuit for breach of contract and corporate espionage. They are threatening to seize the bakery, the house, Dad's pension, everything. You have to bring the jar back. Please, they are going to put me in jail. I smiled. The vinegar. I knew the acidity would fool the initial smell test, but I also knew it would kill the commercial yeast within 24 hours if not fed with sugar. I had sold them a ticking time bomb of dead sludge. I made a coffee and sat on the porch. My phone rang again. It was Dante. I answered. Hello, Dante. Luca! He sounded like he was hyperventilating. Thank God, where are you? You have to come to the city, right now. Bring the jar. I don't have the jar, I lied calmly. You took it, remember? You and the men in the blue coats. Stop it, he screamed. We know you switched it. Global Foods is here, Luca. Their lawyers are in Dad's office. They are freezing our accounts. They are calling it grand larceny. You have to come save us." "Save you?" I took a sip of coffee. "You fired me, Dante. You bought me out. $50,000, remember? You said science was reliable. Why don't you ask the scientists to fix it?" "We can't," he sobbed. "The authentic flavor profile, the bacterial culture. It takes decades to replicate. They need the original source. They need Nona's mother." "And what makes you think I still have it?" I asked. "Maybe I threw it in the river. Maybe I baked a final loaf and ate it." "Don't say that," my father's voice cut in. He was on speakerphone. He sounded old and broken. "Luca, son, please. This is the family legacy. This is your grandmother's name." "No, Dad," I said, my voice hardening. "The legacy was the bread. You sold the name. You sold the building. You sold me out for a check you haven't even cashed yet. Nona left the mother to me, not to the business, to me, and I am keeping her safe." "How much?" Dante interrupted. "How much do you want? I'll double the severance, 100 grand, cash." I laughed. It was a genuine belly laugh. "You still don't get it, do you? You don't have 100 grand, Dante. You have a breach of contract lawsuit. You have nothing. You are bankrupt. You just don't know it yet." "Luca, listen to me," a new voice spoke up. Smooth, corporate, dangerous. "This is Mr. Sterling from Global Foods. We can make all this unpleasantness go away. If you bring the authentic culture to our lab within 4 hours, we will drop the fraud charges against your brother. We will reinstate the contract. We will even offer you a consulting fee." "A consulting fee?" I asked. "To teach you how to mass-produce my heritage? No thanks." "Mr. Vance," Sterling's voice dropped an octave, "we have resources you can't imagine. We will sue you personally. We will bury you in litigation for the rest of your life." "Go ahead," I said. "Sue me for what? I didn't sign the contract. Dante did. I didn't steal the jar. Dante did. I didn't promise you $20 million worth of bread. Dante did. All I did was leave my job with my personal property." I looked at the jar sitting next to me on the table, bubbling happily in the morning sun. "Here is my counteroffer," I said. "Name it," Dante said desperately. "I don't want the money. I don't want the consulting fee. I want you to admit it." "Admit what?" "Admit that you can't buy soul. Admit that you destroyed the bakery because you were greedy. Go out to that line of customers, the ones you call market share, and tell them exactly why there is no bread today. Tell them you tried to feed them frozen garbage." "I can't do that," Dante whispered. "It would ruin my reputation." "Your reputation is already dead, Dante," I said. "It died the minute you cut that padlock." I hung up. I blocked their numbers. I blocked the bakery's number. Then I packed up my car. I wasn't going back to the city to save them. I was going to do exactly what Nona would have wanted. I drove 2 towns over to a small, struggling Italian deli run by an old friend of my grandfather. I walked in with the jar in my hands. "Giuseppe," I said, "I need a job. I can't pay you for rent, but I can make you the best focaccia this side of the Atlantic." Giuseppe looked at the jar, then at me. He smiled. "The kitchen is yours, Luca." 2 days later, the news broke. Global Foods sued my family for $50 million. They seized the bakery building. They seized Dante's condo. They seized my father's retirement fund. But the real story wasn't the lawsuit. It was the smell coming from Giuseppe's deli. It didn't take long for the truth to rise, just like good dough. Within a week, the word was out. The original Nonna Rosa bakery in the city was boarded up, plastered with "seized by Marshall" signs. The Global Foods lawsuit was brutal and public. They didn't just sue for the money back, they sued for damages to their brand, claiming my family had engaged in culpable fraud. Dante declared personal bankruptcy. His luxury condo, his car, his expensive watch collection, all gone to pay legal fees for a defense that didn't exist. Meanwhile, a different kind of line was forming 2 towns over. It started with a few locals smelling the rosemary and olive oil focaccia coming from Giuseppe's deli. Then, a food blogger who used to frequent our old shop tracked me down. She posted one photo of a loaf of country white bread with the caption, "Found him. The soul didn't die, it just moved upstate." By the weekend, the line stretched 3 blocks. People weren't coming for a brand name, they were coming for the bread. I had to hire 3 assistants just to keep the ovens full. Giuseppe, who had been on the verge of retiring, was now managing the busiest storefront in the county, grinning like a schoolboy. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, about a month later, the bell above the door chimed. The lunch rush was over, and the shop was quiet. I looked up from the kneading bench, my hands covered in flour. Standing there was my father, Marco. He looked smaller than I remembered. His chef's coat was gone, replaced by a cheap windbreaker. He looked tired, old, and defeated. He walked up to the counter. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just pointed to a loaf of rustic sourdough cooling on the rack, the bread made from Nona's mother. Can I buy a slice?" he asked, his voice shaking. I wiped my hands on my apron. I didn't charge him. I cut a thick slice, toasted it slightly, drizzled it with olive oil, and handed it to him on a paper plate. He took a bite. He closed his eyes. I saw his shoulders drop. I saw a tear leak out and run down his unshaven cheek. "It tastes like her," he whispered. "It tastes exactly like 1985. "I know," I said, "because I didn't try to change it." He finished the slice in silence. Then he looked at me. "Dante got a job," he said quietly. "Sales rep for a frozen pizza company. He drives around to gas stations trying to sell microwave calzones. He hates it." "He wanted to sell frozen food," I said, kneading the dough rhythmically. "Now he gets to." "I am sorry, Luca," my father said. "I let him talk me into it. I thought the legacy was the money. I thought the legacy was the building." "The building is just bricks, Dad," I said. "The legacy is the thing you feed every day." He nodded. He lingered for a moment, looking at the jar of starter bubbling on the shelf behind me, safe and warm. "You were right to leave," he said. "We didn't deserve it." He turned and walked out into the rain. I never saw him again. I sent him a check every month, anonymous, enough to keep the heat on in his small apartment, but I never invited him back into the kitchen. Some ingredients, once spoiled, ruined the whole batch. Today, I own the deli. I renamed it The Mother. We don't have a marketing budget. We don't have a CEO. We just have flour, water, salt, and time. Global Foods eventually dropped the Nonna Rosa line. It failed in test markets. Focus groups said it tasted soulless. They were right. Sometimes, late at night, when the oven is cooling and the shop is quiet, I talk to the jar. I tell Nonna about the customers. I tell her about the smell of the rain. And I promise her, over and over again, that as long as I am standing, this bread will never see the inside of a freezer. My brother wanted to build an empire on a shortcut. He learned the hard way that you can't cheat chemistry, and you certainly can't cheat heritage. The only thing that rises in the end is the truth. Please note that this is a fictional story collected and edited by us for entertainment and educational purposes, aiming to promote emotional awareness, empathy, and understanding. It is absolutely not intended to spread hatred, offend, or cause harm. The story of Luca teaches us that authenticity is the ultimate currency. In a world obsessed with scaling up, selling out, and moving fast, there is immense power in slowing down and doing things the right way. It also reminds us that stewardship, caring for what you have been given, is more important than ownership. Now, I want to ask you, if you were Luca, would you have forgiven your father and let him work in the new bakery? Or was the betrayal of selling the family legacy too great to overcome? Do you think Dante got what he deserved? Leave your opinion in the comments below so we can discuss it together. Remember to like and subscribe to Revenge Rain to catch more compelling stories. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.